أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our live show on Hidayat TV, the Islamic Insights. My name is Zishaan Moledina, and I'd like to welcome here with me in the studio Brother Shabbar Mahdi, where inshallah we will together be discussing the topic in relation to the justice of the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But before we begin our discussion, I'd like to ask Brother Shabbar to start off with some recitation from the Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا جاءك المنافقون قالوا نشهد إنك لرسول الله والله يعلم إنك لرسوله والله يشهد إن المنافقين لكاذبون أن اتخذوا أيمانهم جنة فسدوا عن سبيل الله إنهم ساء ما كانوا يعملون ذلك بأنهم آمنوا ثم كفروا فتبع على قلوبهم فهم لا يفقهون وإذا رأيتهم تعجبك أجسامهم وإن يقولوا تسمع لقولهم كأنهم خشب مسندة يحسبون كل صيحة عليهم هم العدو فاحذرهم قاتلهم الله أنى يؤفكون وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا يستغفر لكم رسول الله لووا رؤوسهم ورأيتهم يسدون وهم مستكبرون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Ahsant. Dear viewers, this is a live interactive show, so please do dial into the number you see on your screens, and inshallah ask your questions in relation to this topic, and we'll endeavor to answer these questions. The justice of Allah, Shabbar, a very important concept within Islam. It forms part of our usul-e-din, the foundation of the religion and the roots of the religion. And for sure, understanding these concepts will only bring about strong branches which come off this important aspect of the religion itself. So in terms of the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how do we define justice? What is justice?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وأهل الطيبين الطاهرين. First of all, it's important that we reflect, because many times we take knowledge which is given to us, and it's given to us dogmatically. So it's given to us saying, look, these are the usul-ud-din, these are the five, and these are the furu, these are your imams, these are your prophets, accept it. We don't reflect, and then we don't have stronger faith. We need to reflect that one of the most important things is that straight after Tawheed and oneness of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to believe in His justice. In other words, He's shown us that justice is the next most important attribute. He could have chosen any attribute. He could have chosen mercy, wrath, knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the omnipresent or omniscient nature. No, He chose justice. So when we reflect, we think, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose justice? And this is a question that we can pose to the viewers rhetorically. But they think about why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that the second basis of this religion is justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, adl And adala of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we can translate not as equality, as equity. Equality is that everyone gets the same. He gets £5, he gets £5, she gets £5, everyone gets the same amount, the same due. Equity is they get with regards to their capabilities or what their right is. And that's the primary way in which we define justice, is the consideration of the rights of others. So for example, with regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I have done good deeds and you have done bad, or for example, you've done more good deeds than me, or all you've done in your life is good deeds and all I've done is bad deeds. Equity and justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means that you will go to heaven, I'll go to hell. Because it's what I've done. An example that the scholars of theology give is, for example, as a teacher. He won't be called just if he gives everyone the same mark. That's not just. Or if he doesn't discipline the good or the bad. He's called just when he gives them their marks in relation to their capabilities and their abilities and the work they did, as well as he disciplines those that are bad and rewards those that are good. That's justice. So the first thing is that you consider the right of others, and the second is you put things in their proper place. If this is due for you, I give it to you. When we look at justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's important that we also try and implement justice in our own lives. We've mentioned before in the show about the justice we should have in our own lives and the way in which we're not just. One of the conditions of the Imam of Jama'ah is justice. We need to think, are we actually just? Do we treat everyone fairly? Do we give everyone their right? But the way we translate justice, or we understand this word justice and adl, is giving the right of others and putting what should be put in its place. Now, one thing is important to mention, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we'll discuss more inshallah, He has the power and the capability to be unjust. Because if He didn't, then He would be, He wouldn't have the free power, He wouldn't have free will. He would be constricted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are no boundaries to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He can do what He wants. In other words, He could be unjust. He chooses not to. So that's important that the viewers understand, and that we understand, that it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is restricted or it's impossible for Him to be unjust. He is just never unjust. He's always, His works and His actions and His amr is always through justice. But this is what we mean by justice in a lexical type of sense.
I think it's a very important differentiation make there, that often people class justice as equality. Correctly mentioned so very importantly that it's not necessarily equality, more of it's equity. So in terms of justice itself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you mentioned, acts out of His own wishes, His own will in a just manner. But how can you prove that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, the Creator, is actually just?
Primarily this is very difficult, because the main part and the main percentage of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice will be openly zahir, openly expressed, shown to us on Yawm al-Qiyamah, Yawm al-Din. Because there we will be able to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judges us. And that's where His justice will flow the most and will be shown to us. Secondly, it's important to understand that justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, is ruling currently. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't ruling over His servants in an unjust way. We just can't tell that it's justice. But if you look at the system that has been created, the system of the universe, the system of religion, we see that the system of religion is made up of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His messengers, the sharia which comes from the Quran and the messengers. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not just and did not want justice Himself, He would never have brought down the Quran, the Sharia and the messengers in order to tell us what is right and what is wrong. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can and does, for na'udhu billah, if He works in an unjust way, what's the point of bringing down the Quran and the messengers? Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unjust, His justice is that He tells us what is right and what is wrong. That's one segment of His justice. His justice is that He tells us, this is what I want from you. So this is one way in which we can tell the justice. For example, there's a hadith which says from one of the Imams that the prophets and the messengers were sent in order to put down Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice on this earth. So one segment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice is that He rules by giving us these sources. And there's an example where, for example, a teacher, he tells us he's going to give us an exam, but he doesn't give us the materials. he would be called unjust. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us He's going to give us a test, He gives us the material. So this is one section of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice.
Thank you. I think we have a caller, so we'll just take this call. Assalamu alaikum.
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for calling.
My name is Aska and I'm calling from London. Before your show started, I and my wife, we were discussing the same subject. So it's a coincidence that this show came up. So
Alhamdulillah.
I have a question.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think the call dropped.
Inshallah, I can try back.
Inshallah. So I think you were discussing with regards to how we can show why Allah is actually just.
So the fact that He's given us the Quran and these means for ourselves to be just shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this way is just. Because He's giving us these materials. So in this one segment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice only. Of course His justice is ever expanding and it's impossible to comprehend, but that's one segment. Secondly, we find that, and this is a very difficult way to explain it, but one of the prerequisites of perfection is justice. In the same way, one of the prerequisites of perfection is knowledge, and perfect knowledge. Now this goes into a very detailed field known as speculative philosophy, and it proves that one of the prerequisites of perfection, because we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfect. If He is God, He has to be perfect. So He has to have perfect knowledge and He has to be just. Now that it goes into a very difficult discussion and has very technical arguments. Another thing is that, for example, there is a jahil, an ignorant person. Can he then impart knowledge to a student? If there's a jahil teacher, he knows nothing, for example, about maths. Can he teach the student math? No. He can't impart this knowledge. In the same way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, they all have knowledge. Even though it's a tiny amount, we all have knowledge. We all have life. We all have some degree of power. We all have some degree of perfection. Because we have it, it proves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have, and of course a different form. Because it is impossible that we have knowledge but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have knowledge. For an ignorant teacher cannot teach. A powerless person cannot give power. A lifeless person or entity cannot give life. In the same way, someone who is unjust cannot give justice. In other words, because there is justice found, even though it's a tiny amount, because there is justice found within us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala therefore must be just.
So why then does He need to be just, apart from having obviously the idea that in order to teach other people He needs to be just Himself? But before we answer my question, just take this call again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm the same person.
The call dropped again, I think.
Ya Allah.
No problem. Okay, and so inshallah, basically, we were discussing the fact that why then does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala need to be just?
Again, look at the whole system of this religion. First we were in arwah and anwar. First we were souls. We were put into physical bodies and brought onto this earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that He asked the mountains, He asked the jinns, He asked every single creation whether they would be willing to take this responsibility that has been given to us. All of them denied. The humans then stood up and said, we'll take this responsibility of khilafah and we'll take this responsibility of going through this test from you, Ya Allah. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put us on this earth. As the Quran says, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِّنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْءٍ مَذْكُورًا إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن نُّطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا إِنَّ هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us from this drop.
Sorry, again, I think we've got the caller again. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I think I called.
Ya Allah.
Inshallah,
I thought
we'll
third
try
time
one
lucky,
more
but
time.
unfortunately.
Inshallah.
Yes, so as he says that we created you from this drop and then we gave you eyes and ears and we tested you to see which of you is thankful and which of you rejects and which of you is not thankful. In other words, we've been tested. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this promise that He is going to test us. Does it make sense then, therefore, that there is someone all his life he never committed one sin, and there is someone all his life all he did was commit sin? On the day of judgment both go to heaven. Is that just? If that is the case, this whole system breaks down. We have proved, and there is proof, that religion is required. Inshallah, we'll look one day. This is a very in-depth topic of why religion is required. Proof has been done that religion is required. Hand in hand with religion is justice. If justice breaks down, religion breaks down. Because we've proved one, the other must be there. Because it is impossible that there is this whole concept of religion if then, on the day of judgment, there is no sense of differentiation. And there's no taqsim. There's no putting one person in hell while in heaven. A beautiful story is narrated with regards to the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because as I said before, we only have this very limited view on the world. We can't see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing, or what His amr is. As people say, God works in mysterious ways. We may think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done something against us, and immediately we'll go on the musalla, or even we'll sit down and we'll start complaining. Ya Allah, you're meant to be just, you've done this to me, I've failed in my exams, I didn't get this job, why is this person, for example, we'll think he's unjust. When in actual fact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is working in such a way that there is always justice. A beautiful story that Nabi Musa was told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Nabi Musa salamullah alayhi, that I'll show you my justice. He said, go to this valley. So he stood and he could see the valley, and there was this person walking. Now this person was walking, looking at the valley, the stream that was flowing, subhanallah, subhanallah, he was walking past. He didn't realize, but from his pocket some money fell out. He kept on going forward. Then a small child came. He began seeing everything. This small child, he saw the money, immediately grabbed it because he was a child, put it in his pocket and ran away. Another man was then going across, subhanallah, mashallah, beautiful valley, beautiful stream. That other person, the first person, came back. He said, you must have taken my money. So this person has never seen this before, doesn't know what money he's talking about. He said, no, I haven't done anything. I'm just coming to see, I'm walking by. He said, no, you've taken my money. This first person then kills the third person. The child was the middle, he's gone. Kills the third person and goes away. He realizes the money wasn't on him, but he goes away. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns to Musa and says, Musa, did you see my justice? Maybe Musa is saying, wait. One person's money was stolen by a child. Another person was killed unfairly. Ya Allah, I'm not doubting you, but how does this justice work? He said that first person had indirectly taken money from this child. So maybe he sold him something that was worth £10 for 50. So in this way he stole money indirectly from the child. So the child is being repaid by taking that money. In the second way, the third person, he had killed the first person's father, but the first person didn't know about it. So the first person killing him is reciprocating for his father's death. Now that doesn't mean we can go kill whoever we want or steal, for example. But it's trying to show that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice may not be very obvious to us, but it's there. We cannot see it maybe. We might think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not doing justice because someone has more bounties and other person has more difficulties. But if you look at the actual way in which this whole system is poised, there is justice. Another way, another segment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice is He's given us free will. So He's given us He's just in this way that He's allowing us to do what we want. So we find different segments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice. The main part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice, of course, will be Zahir, Yawm al-Qiyamah, when we will see that وَمَن يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَن يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. Every atom, every ounce, every second of good I've done, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward me, and every second of bad, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish me.
Thank you. We have another caller. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Wa alaikum salam.
I'm the same caller. The call was dropped due to some technical problem.
No problem. Thank you very much for calling again.
Okay. My name is Aska, and I'm calling from London, and my question is about Adl. Yeah? My question is that can you give me one example of Adl according to the belief of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah? I know what Adl is according to Shia Isna Ashri.
Okay.
Although Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they do not recognize Adl as one of the usul.
Correct.
But they do.
Okay. I think we
Okay.
got the gist of the
We
question.
did. The question was with regards to adal. Obviously, we've defined what adalat is. However, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah brothers in faith, they don't actually class this as a part of the concept of usul. And the brother was asking as to perhaps some proof or any kind of evidence to show how they can perhaps believe in this.
So he wanted some light on
Their view on it.
Okay. So I think then we can get on to the next part to do with the
Different groups.
Yeah, the different groups.
So inshallah, I'll just come back
So
to
that will be intertwined with this.
Sure. Okay. So, kind of linking the question that the brother had into our next question, there are kind of numerous groups within the Shia theology. One being the Ash'arite and the other being the Mu'tazilite. Who are these two kind of main different groups, and what are their beliefs?
Primarily, I think the coolest question is very good because we know a lot about Shia beliefs and Shia justice, and Shia adl of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Shia madhab is very clear. That whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is within His justice.
Finally, we were discussing this a bit before the show as well. So
Yeah, whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is within His justice. And it's clear within the Shia madhab. And of course, there are always some questions that arise, but it's answered by the Shia ulama. It's also interesting to find out what the Sunni madhab and the Sunni brothers, Ahl Tasannun, believe and what groups they have. And this relates to a field known as kalam. Kalam literally means to discuss or to talk. Because kalam always involves discussion and mubahatha and questioning and answering different groups. Kalam, scholastic theology. Okay? The two main groups, and this is in relation to the brother's question, the two main groups found within kalam are Mu'tazila and Ash'ari, or Mu'tazilite and Ash'arite, as we would say in the English way. The Mu'tazila, also known as the Qadri, they believe in Qadr. They believe in free will, and that whatever we have our own free will to do what we want. The other group, Ash'ari, they say they believe in Jabr. Jabr is that they have no free will and everything is predestined. The Mu'tazilites, it said there was one of the primary seminarians of Kalam was known as Hasan al-Basri. Whether he was Shia, he was part of the Sunni madhab. Hasan al-Basri, one of his students, Wasil ibn At'ah, he was the founder of the Mu'tazilites. And as we said, they believe in free will. They believe that actions are intrinsically just or unjust. In other words, we as human beings can tell whether an action is just or unjust, whether something is right or wrong. For example, we can tell as human beings that stealing is unjust. And we can tell that, for example, the different examples we get for the teacher grading in a just way, that's justice. So they believe that actions are intrinsically just or unjust. The difference here between Mu'tazila and Ash'ari is that Ash'ari say no. Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is just. In other words, what we perceive to be just and right may not be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perceives to be just. So for example, they give an example, that for example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to throw Amirul Mu'mineen, na'udhu billah, in hell and throw Ibn Muljim, la'natullah alayh, into heaven, this would be just. That's what they say. I mean to think about that. They say that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is just. They're trying to say that they don't restrict Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this way. The Mu'tazila say no. Actions are just or unjust intrinsically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just acts towards the just. And as we mentioned before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can, if He wants to, act in an unjust way, but He chooses not to. Shaykh Mohsin Qara'ati, a very good scholar and teacher and author, he gives an example. He says that human beings, as in I, could take out my eyeball and crush it. Do I do so? No, because it's stupid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same way, He can act unjust. He chooses not to because He knows it's not the right way. The whole system is structured in this way, structured on justice. So these Mu'tazila, they have many other different beliefs. For example, when we look at Tawheed, this is a technical discussion. Tawheed, dar dhat, dar sifat, dar af'al. Tawheed is within actions, within attributes, and within the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this requires a long, lengthy discussion. Tawheed within actions means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is solely responsible for the actions He does.
Just before we go on to the next one, we have another caller. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you for calling.
उर्दू में बात करनी
जी
बिस्मिल्लाह.
उर्दू में सवाल करना था.
जी बिस्मिल्लाह.
ये पूछता था मैं, दो सवाल है. ये पूछता था कि जो तस्वीरें खिंचवाना जायज़ है
जी. और
दूसरा सवाल ये है कि हज पे जब जाते हैं तो जो एहराम होता है तो वो चादर ओढ़ ले तो फिर क्या होगा उसके लिए. और तीसरा सवाल ये कि जो गुस्ताखी रसूल होता है तो क्या उसको समझाना चाहिए कि गुस्ताखी क्यों करता है, तो क्या करना चाहिए उसके लिए. और अहले बैत की जो शान में गुस्ताखी करता है उसके लिए क्या किया जाए.
ठीक है, शुक्रिया. These are on a
two questions, ihram and
photo, if taking
pictures.
photos, and his last one was about insulting the Prophet or going against the Prophet's fadila. These are miscellaneous. If at the end we get time, inshallah, we'll endeavor to. So I was saying, Tawheed dar sifat, Tawheed dar af'al, Tawheed dar dhat. Tawheed dar af'al is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions, He is solely based for them, and He solely is the initiator of His actions. So for example, if creation takes place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that does so and initiates it, maybe through a means. This is Tawheed dar af'al. Mu'tazila therefore do not believe in Tawheed dar af'al, as in the unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions, because they say He must act towards justice. And this is a confusing discussion, but we'll move on just so that the viewers know what their beliefs are. And they have many different beliefs. They also believe, for example, the Mu'tazila, that if there is someone who is a victim of carnal sins, so sins to do with the carnal desire for alcohol and other desires, etc., they are neither believer, they are not an unbeliever. They are in the middle. And that's why sometimes this is known as the middle way within the Mu'tazili school of thought. And there is a very long story in the way in which Wasil and Amr bin Ubayd, his cousin, they were sitting with other theologians, Hassan al-Basri, and Wasil disagreed with something to do with this issue, and he got up and he left. And so Hassan al-Basri said, "I'tazalna Wasil." I'tazalna means separated. Mu'tazilat means those that have separated. So they were a group that separated, and they believe in this way. The Shia agree with the Mu'tazili on this issue of justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the way that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is justice, but He does with regards to the things that are right. In other words, it's not that He can do wrong and it will become right, which the Ash'ari believe. We believe that there is a law set down of right and wrong, just and unjust, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abides by that law. So that's the first part of the answer to the brother's question. The second is Ash'ari. Ash'ari, the founder was Abu al-Hasan Ash'ari, and he came later on. Some say he was the descendant of Abu Musa Ash'ari, who is very famous, someone who sat on the fence. Very long discussion about Abu Musa Ash'ari. And he studied under many different people. Famous Ash'arite are known as Ghazali, for example. Imam al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin al-Razi. Now these Fakhruddin al-Razi and Imam al-Ghazali, they watered down the Ash'ari school of thought from kalam to a more gnosis and mystical thought. So it used to be solid kalam, and then they watered it down to become more to do with gnosis and irfan. They believe that the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are not part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge, but it's not part of Him, it's a separate attribute. And the way in which Shia respond to that is they say, it's a separate attribute, it's always been there, it's completely independent. So does that mean it's God? Because God is independent, He's always been there. If His attributes are like that as well, then are you trying to say that's another God? Also we say, if it's separate, if the attributes are separate, does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was never these things before? In other words, they say the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is separate from him. Does that mean that at one point he does not have knowledge? Na'udhu billah. So this is one of the things that they believe in, the Ash'arites. They also believe that God can physically be seen. So for example, the Quran says, Yadullah fawqa aydihim. The hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on their hands. Or kullu shay'in halakahu illa wajh. Everything will perish except for his face. Or فَأَيْنَمَا طَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you look, you'll find the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a face? No, metaphorical. They believe in this way. And as we said, this example that they give of it, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam being put in hell and Ibn al-Muljam being put in heaven, this would be just. Because whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just. Now, how does that make sense that whatever Allah subhanahu, we're not saying Allah is restricted. As we said, He can be unjust if He wants to. He just doesn't. And He always works by the justice and the laws of the universe. So those are the different areas we find within the Sunni school of thought, Ash'ari, Mu'tazila. There's others, these are the two main. As I said, the Shia don't agree completely with the Mu'tazila before someone gets the wrong impression. We agree with their stance on justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are the two divisions, and you'll find in many different books of Kalam, many different arguments and different viewpoints, their proofs, the Shia proofs, the Ash'ari proofs. Very interesting. As I'm sure we've seen, very technical, but the Shia, the Mu'tazilite and Ash'arite are completely opposites. And they both stemmed during around the beginning of the 1st century. The Mu'tazilites stemmed. This is when Kalam was actually very sort of spurting out. And the Ash'arites came about 200 years later.
Thank you. Quite a technical explanation, but I hope inshallah that answers the brother's question. So we'll move on slightly. As we mentioned earlier, justice forms part of the Usul al-Din. It could have been many other things. It could have been Rahman, could have been Rahim, but with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's justice. So when there is this justice, what is our response to the injustices that occur? Maybe not injustice depending on the way you look at them, but things like death, suffering, things like innocent children dying and poverty. Is this not unjust?
Sheikh Mohsin Qara'ati gives a very beautiful example. He says there is a man, his child and a dog. The man leaves his house to go to the market. The door is left open. The dog and the child are in the house. He goes to the market. As he comes back, the dog greets him, but covered around the dog's mouth is blood, dripping. The man immediately thinks, he's killed my son. He had a gun with him, he took out his gun and shot the dog. He went inside and he saw his child was safe and sound, and a dead wolf was lying there. Then he realized that within the village for a few days a wolf was roaming and it was breaking into people's houses and attacking and etc. So this wolf had entered. The dog, trying to protect the child, had bitten and killed the wolf, which is why blood had surrounded its mouth. And so the man had thought and assumed that the dog had killed his son, when in fact it was someone else. Sheikh Mohsin Qara'ati says 2 points from this story. Number one is hasty decisions. For example, we didn't get a job, and straight away I start blaming Allah and I take a decision and I stop praying, or for example I lose my faith. Later on I'll realize, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was working for my benefit. But secondly, there are people, for example, in this earth suffering, as you mentioned. There are children dying and innocent people getting killed all over the world. Not just innocent Shias, innocent people all over the world being killed. How does it relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice? The first, what the story proves, this example, is that we blame Allah. Of course, we're not calling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala our dog or comparing him to one, but we blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for doing this injustice where there are actually other culprits. As the Quran says, ظَهْرَ الْفَسَادَ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِ النَّاسِ. Corruption has spread on this earth, all over this land, because of men and their hands. In other words, if there is someone who is suffering, or is hungry, or is dying innocent, it's not because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has given everyone free will. It's because of the people. Or for example, the ulama say that everyone is given rizq, sustenance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we find someone who is on the brink of death because they do not have clean water or there's no food, we ask the question, Ya Allah, you said everyone is given rizq, you distribute. Why is it that there are people dying? The reply is because someone else has stolen their rizq. In other words, it's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, okay, you will get this much, you will get this much, you will get that much. But people have invaded. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. People, they have invaded, they have stolen the rizq of others, which is why other people are suffering. So the main way in which we answer this, the death and suffering of innocent children and innocent people, is not because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's because of people. Suffering can also be explained, inshallah we'll look in a minute, with regards to tests and trying to make us stronger. But the death of, for example, a baby who has no food and no water and their parents didn't have enough money for medicine, is because someone else has stolen their rizq, their sustenance. And you'll find this, go in the countries where these things occur, where people are dying, it's because there's a lot of corruption, because other people have invaded. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensures He is just in what He can do. But He tries to give everyone free will. If someone wants to do this, He lets them do it. On the day of Qiyamah, they'll be responsible. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't work in an unjust way in that sense.
So how do you think suffering then relates to a warning of punishment? Is there a correlation between the two?
Nabi Shu'aib, this is a beautiful story. Nabi Shu'aib salamullah alayhi was walking and he was going into town. And he suddenly smelt a very awkward smell. He looked to his right and he saw that there was this wall which had fallen over, and underneath was one of the believers from his ummah. He had died. So his body was rotting. So in other words, it's a dishonorable death. His body was there on the floor rotting. People were passing by looking, seeing the rotting body with the wall having fallen over it, and they would just go past. So he was like, astaghfirullah, dishonorable death. He went forward and he saw everyone was in black clothes. All shops were closed, schools were closed. So he asked, what's happened here? He said, the king of the time has passed away. And everyone is mourning and they're all going to his funeral. Nabi Shu'aib, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, Ya Allah, I'm not doubting you, I just want to know the philosophy. Why is it that my believer, a pious person, a mu'min, he has been suffering a dishonorable death, whereas the tyrant, unjust ruler is being given an honorable death? What's the reason behind this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, look, this believer wanted something. He needed something, he had some difficulty. Instead of coming straight to me, he went straight to the king. And he asked the king. The king was in such a mood that he said, fine, I'll give it to you. Maybe he needed some money. He said, fine, I'll give it to you. And so he got granted that wish through the king. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, why did he not come through me? Because he was a mu'min. I wanted him to come to me free from all sin. Therefore, I caused him to suffer a dishonorable death, so the punishment for all of those sins would come out in this world. And that king, who was a tyrant, I did not want him to come to me and say, look, I helped your believer, give me your reward. So I took out the reward for his good deed in this world, so that when he came to me, I could punish him for his bad deeds. When this good person came to me, I could remove that bad sin in this life, so he could come to me in a clear and pure way. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us sometimes we have difficulties, sometimes we strive, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may try for the believer, because one observation is that the mu'min or the believer or the Muslim has more difficulties than the kafir or the mushrik or someone who, let alone believe in Allah, let alone atheists. They don't care about Allah, they never even think about God or the goal of the universe. They have so much wealth, happiness, materialistic goods, whereas the believer is striving. Why is it? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves this believer. He wants this believer to come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pure and clean, which is why He gives him difficulty. As the Quran says, أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّا الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ فَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ. Does man think that he can say, I believe, and he won't be tested? Once you say, I believe, you'll be tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this test, this difficulty that we see, that some person is given a greater test than someone else. Why? Strengthens our faith. Sometimes, for example, I injured myself. I was in an accident. Before this accident, I had faith, but not strong faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. after this accident, suddenly my faith was so strong that within my salah I was concentrating, I was lamenting, I became more pious. I built this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So because of this bad thing, which I thought was bad, in actual fact it was to my advantage. The Imams for the Quran says, Inna amwalikum wa awladukum fitna, and la tulhikum amwalikum wa awladukum an dhikrillah. Your family, your wealth, your health, all of these are tests for you. If you're a believer, you'll be tested, you'll have difficulty. So that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can prove that you are righteous and He can reward you abundantly, and also so that He can remove your sins. Also, we need to understand that sometimes we have small setbacks in life, but in actual fact, it's to our advantage. Nabi Yusuf salamullah alayhi, thrown in the well, became a slave. He was imprisoned for an act he didn't do. Then what happened? He became a king. This small setback led to him being raised, him having more capability to help the people. So even though we have small setbacks, it's because of the greater good. And even though we have different levels of difficulty and different levels of suffering, this is because we have different states in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also because if there is someone who has struggled all of their life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reciprocate for that struggle on the day of Qiyamah. In some way, we don't know what way, but of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will. And if there is someone who hasn't struggled one bit, in the same way Allah may not be as lenient towards him on the day of Qiyamah. So in other words, Allah will balance things out by Judgment Day and the bounties He gives. But everything is always balanced, even though to us it may not seem. Many people look, I had a friend, he got this job, I didn't get it. Look at the Quran and see that there are examples within which you may not have got something, or you may have had a setback, but in the long run it's for your advantage.
Do you feel there's a correlation between the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His justice will only inflict or will only give you things in your life that you may only be able to handle?
There's a hadith that says every difficulty and suffering given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can always be counteracted with goodness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never give you something you can't deal with. He'll never give you such a tragedy that you completely lose it and you end up taking a bottle and drinking and losing faith in Allah. He'll never do that. He'll give you something that you can bear, and then He'll test you, and then He'll remove your sins. For example, there's beautiful ahadith that a mu'min will always have, for example, a headache, a pain in a muscle, maybe he'll have a cold. Why? So that these sins are removed. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is helping us. It's better for our sins to be forgiven in this way, or to be wiped out in this way, in this life, than over there. For over there it's much more difficult. So it's better we have sufferings in this life.
So in terms of justice in the Quran, are there any examples you can share with us with regards to how the Quran depicts the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says that He, in other words Allah, is not asked about that which He has done, because He does, but they will be asked. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not be asked about what He has done, what actions He has implemented, what things He has implemented, because He works with justice. But then He says, but they will be asked. Meaning what? They will be asked because their actions will not be with regards to justice. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, who has the courage to try and challenge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he has gone against justice? Whoever does, on the day of Qiyamah they'll see. So in this way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, who thinks that I go against justice? No one can ask me and no one will ask me, because everything I do will be with justice. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah does not desire injustice for any of His servants. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never elevate someone for no reason and drop down someone for no reason. There's always reasoning behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions. And of course, Allah has, just because we don't understand why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done something doesn't mean that it's baseless. Allah is, the infinite knowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. So of course He works and His actions are to do with this knowledge.
So interestingly also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran mentions the fact that He pleases who He pleases and He misguides those who would like to misguide.
Yep.
So isn't this again against the concept of justice in itself?
يُذِلُّ مَن يَشَاءُ وَيَهْدِ مَن يَشَاءُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides whom He pleases, misguides whom He pleases. Now many of the scholars have answered this, because people ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He's just in one chapter of the Quran. In another He's saying He can guide whom He wants, He can misguide whom He wants. We thought that misguiding was the role of shaitan. The answer is this. In other places in the Quran, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah, he says, خَطَمَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ and فَطُبِعَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ. There are some individuals in this life for whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given so many different types of guidance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance is given to everyone endogenously, intrinsically. In other words, to our hearts we are given guidance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though we may not realize it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through ishara and ilham gives us guidance. For example, sometimes we're about to commit a wrong act and suddenly something overcomes us, a voice in our head. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is guiding us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my guidance goes to every single person on this earth. There are a group of people that have constantly, for even the kafirin, even those that aren't Muslim, they receive guidance from Allah. Occasionally they adhere to it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there are some that I have given my guidance to them again and again and again to their hearts, but constantly, again and again, repeatedly, they have neglected it. Because I know therefore that they will never accept my guidance, I seal their hearts. فَطُبِعَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ وَخَتَمَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ. I seal their hearts from guidance of me. Because I seal their hearts, they are not being guided by me. This is what I mean by misguidance. So Allah guides everyone. يَهْدِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ يُضِلُّ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. Misguides everyone means what? He misguides whom He pleases. He seals the heart of those that are constantly neglecting of Him from His own guidance. So basically He's saying, look, I've given you the opportunity many times. If you want to turn your back against me, I'll also turn. No more guidance from me. I seal their hearts. So that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means when يُضِلُّ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. Here we find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us that He sends His guidance to everyone. Black, white, young, old, Muslim, kafir, Christian, Jew, everyone gets guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We just need to understand that we need to accept and implement Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance when it is given to us.
Just a different kind of look at justice in itself. When we have a look at the issue of khums, we find that part of the khums is dedicated for sayyids. Is this not in itself again bias or
very good question?
In any way?
The ulama have answered this as well. Sahm al-Imam and Sahm al-Sadat. So khums is split into two. Sahm al-Imam is the part for the Imam, Imam Mahdi ajallahu ta'ala for his Sharif, and this can be used in mosques and hawzat and orphanages, etc. And Sahm al-Sadat giving to the poor Sadat who are unable to survive. There's conditions in there. Here the question comes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you say you're just, but is your Sharia just therefore? That this khums is only given to the Sadat? The reply given is yes, khums, that section, half of that khums, Sahm Sadat, can only be given to the poor sayyids. However, zakat we give on Eid, and zakat is due on a wide variety of items, for example, dates, barley, wheat, gold, silver, etc. Zakat, which is 2.5% of that, zakat from that and zakat from Eid cannot go to Sayyid, that can only go to non-Sayyids. So in one way, this part of khums can only go to the Sadat, and that zakat can only go to the non-Sadat. So Sayyids aren't allowed to take that. In this way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows in the way He's balanced out the two things. So yes, they are getting, but also the other side are getting. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has never, even though we may think He has never discriminated white, black, yellow, whatever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts all because He's created. And so even within His Sharia, He has given justice. As we mentioned, it's not equality, it's equity.
Again, with regards to Sharia, if we look at blood money, if we look at inheritance, half again is dedicated for women. So how is that part of justice?
The inheritance of a man is twice that of a woman. Or in other words, the woman's inheritance is half that of a man. In the same way, diya is blood money. So for example, if a woman is killed, the amount that has to be given is half that if a man is killed. The answer to this is simple, that it is the duty of the man to earn the living and bring in the money. So if a man dies, let's say he was going to earn £500,000 throughout his life. If a man dies, all of that is gone. So in order to compensate for their not being a man, whose responsibility it is to work and bring in the money, therefore they get twice the blood money of the woman. And because the women's they can work, but because their responsibility is not to work, in other words, they don't they don't have that much financial capacity. For example, a man, because his responsibility is to work, he could have bought in this £500,000 throughout his life. But because he was killed, that was lost. A woman, she was not working because it wasn't her responsibility, so she might have bought in, let's say she worked a bit, £10,000 within her life. So diya twice is given to the man to outweigh this. Inheritance in the same way. Inheritance double is given to the man than the woman, because the man has the burden of spending and taking care of his family. So for example, there's a man and their brother and sister, they both get inheritance. The brother gets, for example, £50,000 and the sister gets 25,000. His 50,000, he has to now spend that on his family, on kids and wife and food and shelter and home, etc., because it's his responsibility. The sister, she gets 25,000. She doesn't have to spend on the family. She can use that for herself. So because with regards to the rights and responsibilities, the man has more responsibilities for providing for the home, he gets double inheritance to outweigh this extra expenditure.
Just going back a bit, could you give any examples of the way in which Allah's punishment has kind of had an impact in terms of justice through the Quran? So is there any kind of period in history or period in time where Allah describes whereby He's punished a certain group of people because of the justice that He wanted to prevail over these people?
You find different examples, Ashab al-Ras, Ashab al-Ad and Thamud, etc. One question that also comes, I just remembered that, why is it that, for example, I steal, or the Quran says, وَيْلُ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ. The mutaffifin, how unjust are they? That they take more and they give less. For example, in the shop, he'll say he's giving you 1 kilo. He'll give you 900 less and he'll take more. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Wail. Wow ya lam. Wail is known as the deepest pit in hell. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing that if you are unjust and there's no equality and equity within your life, this is your end. Also, Ashab al-Ras, Ashab al-Ad and Thamud, there's a hadith, the most important justice is being just to yourself. Ashab al-Ras, Ashab al-Ad and Thamud, etc. Or for example, the people of Sabt, they thought they could trick Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were also unjust to themselves in the way that they would not, their hearts were saying there's one God, Thamud and Ad, but they would deny. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent His adhab on them on this life. There are many examples of people that have stolen, have taken more money, or have done this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He reciprocates for that by giving them less in this world. So for example, if I stole from you, in the future maybe, I'll be begging on the street. There have been examples. Or if these mutaffifin, they will never succeed. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you take more and give less, in this life you may get tiny bit of money, but there will be no barakah in that money. It will run out very quickly. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions within the Quran what punishment people have been given. People of Sabt, they tried to cheat Allah by fishing on Saturday. And Allah sent His punishment down to them. Because injustice is not part of Islam and should not be part of Muslims.
I think that brings us to the close to the end of our show. If you'd like to end the show with a dua, inshallah.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya da'im al-fadli ala al-bariyah. يا باسط اليدين بالعتية يا صاحب المواهب السنية صل على محمد وآل محمد خير الورى سجية واغفر لنا واغفر لنا واغفر لنا يا ذا العلا في هذه العشية اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات، أنك مجيب الدعوات، أنك رافع الدرجات، أنك ولي حسنات، أنك على كل شيء قدير.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Dear viewers, that brings us to the end of our show for tonight. Thank you very much for listening, and inshallah we'll see you again next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.